Hi guys, I apologize about the weird lighting / angle on this. My computer wouldn't let me record this week, so I'm doing it on my cell phone again. I need to get that fixed. But just to jump into my presentation, the question I chose to ask this week is, what is worth teaching? Then I asked 3 questions in response to that question. And so the first question I asked is, how can my students help me understand what is worth teaching? The second question I asked is, how can the sources I use influence my knowledge of what is worth teaching? And then I asked, what role should common sense or real-world experience play when determining what is worth teaching? So just jumping into our first slide here, if we go down to that first bullet point, the first thing that I thought was important in light of this question is paying attention to the individual needs of students. And this is something I will touch on a lot throughout my presentation. I found that it was a concept that really flowed between my different bullet points and my different questions. But really understanding your students, developing a good relationship with them, knowing what will benefit them the most in learning is really a good way that your students can help you understand what is worth teaching. And kind of going along with that, one of our classmates commented on this question, and he suggested formal questionnaires and assessments, and I really liked that. That's a really solid, concrete way to help understand the needs of your students. And I think it's a really good way to show your students, because sometimes your students might not understand that you are actively seeking for ways to help know what they want to be taught and what they need to be taught. So a formal questionnaire and assessment, I think especially if you're teaching in an adult or a community setting, could be very useful, even just in developing that relationship and really showing that you're interested in knowing the needs of your students. And then kind of following that, I found a great resource that talked about creating shared learning targets. So what a learning target is it's almost like a GPS. It kind of guides the destination for the lesson. It helps students know what to learn, how deeply to learn it, and in what ways they can demonstrate or will be demonstrating their new learning. And I thought that was really cool. I know in high school, my teachers would write lesson objectives on the board, and I think it's kind of that same concept, or it is that same concept. But I think that learning targets are a very valuable thing because they should be done with the input of your students, and that's a great way to get everybody on the same page and get your students really actively involved in telling you what is worth learning for them and what their needs are. The next slide is, how can the sources I use influence my knowledge of what is worth teaching? So my first bullet point just says, understand the significance of content, but also teaching strategies. I found another resource that talked about teaching strategies being used in college, and how a lot of times college professors really pay a lot of attention to content, but not to teaching strategies. So it's really important that we avoid content that isn't going to motivate our students, and don't think that the content of what we're teaching is more complex than the actual teaching process is. It's really easy for us to think that it's so important that we shove a lot of content down our students' throats that we forget how we're teaching them and what we're teaching them. And then moving on to our third slide, if it will load, I asked the question, what role should common sense or real-world experience play when determining what is worth teaching? And I didn't find it actually, one of our fellow classmates shared this story with me. Let me just pull it up really fast. He shared this story with me about an older gentleman. He was from Maine, and he was a lobster fisherman, but he was just very friendly, very down to earth, and he kind of ended up telling this fellow on an airplane his entire life story, And so this man that he told this story to took it back and connected it to teaching. And he said, classroom teaching makes for long and rugged days. String a bunch of them together and you'll have, like George has had, a long and rugged life. And schools, just like airports at 4 a.m., tend to be places where teachers, like bleary-eyed passengers, keep within themselves. Besides friendships with close colleagues, the only connections we often have to other teachers are those in nods in passing as we move through the halls en route to class. And what about your student-teacher relationships? Are they limited to little more than nods in passing, or do you from time to time stop and say something along the lines of, "Hello, I'm George Johnson of Bailey Island, Maine"? And so that's just kind of saying it's important that we let our students know we want to hear their story and we want them to hear our story, and that's a great way to develop student-teacher relationships. And so kind of gearing that back to common sense and real-world experience, I think it's important to, there again, understand the individual needs of your students. Some people are very, very receptive to scholarly information, and that holds a lot of weight with them, and it should hold a lot of weight with all of us. But there are people who are going to get a lot more out of their learning experience if they have a really deep personal relationship and if there's common sense and real world experience shared within the context of their learning. And so that just kind of brings us to my last bullet point, actually, of what do students respond to. I always think of one of my older brothers who is very responsive to kind of commonsensical ideas and things that he can take back and directly apply. So it's important when considering all of this to make sure that you have found that information from your students so that you are benefiting them in all of the best ways possible. Thanks you guys for watching my presentation. I hope you learned something, and I definitely learned a lot from you guys this week. Thank you!